Every father knows the heartbreak of watching his child drift away after losing their mother. For widowed park ranger Eli Mercer, 25 cents at an estate sale seemed like a small price to pay for any chance to reconnect with his 8-year-old son Caleb. The old treehouse looked abandoned in that massive oak tree, but maybe working on it together could heal what grief had broken between them. When they started cleaning out the weathered wooden structure, they expected to find nothing but old leaves and spider webs. Instead, they discovered journals, drawings, and carved messages left behind by 2 foster children who had disappeared 30 years ago. What began as a father's desperate attempt to bond with his son quickly became something much deeper. The treehouse held secrets that someone had tried very hard to hide. But what really happened to those missing children? Before we jump back, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun filtered through the pine trees surrounding Eli Mercer's modest cabin, casting long shadows across the wooden deck where his coffee had grown cold. He sat in the same rocking chair he'd occupied every morning for the past 2 years, watching his son Caleb through the kitchen window. The boy moved through their morning routine like a ghost. Cereal poured with mechanical precision, backpack checked twice, lunch money counted into his small palm. At 8 years old, Caleb possessed a solemnity that broke Eli's heart daily. Sarah's wedding ring lay in the top drawer of Eli's nightstand, wrapped in the same tissue paper from the funeral home. He hadn't moved it since the day he'd slipped it off her finger in the hospital room, promising her he'd take care of their boy. 2 years later, that promise felt like the heaviest burden he'd ever carried. "Dad, I'm ready for school." Caleb's voice drifted through the screen door, flat and dutiful. Eli rose from his chair, joints protesting the early October chill. At 43, he felt decades older than his years. The park ranger uniform hung looser on his frame than it used to, and gray had begun threading through his brown hair with increasing frequency. Sarah used to tease him about those first gray strands, calling them distinguished. Now they just reminded him of time passing without her. "Coming, buddy?" he called back, forcing warmth into his voice that he hoped sounded genuine. The drive to Pine Valley Elementary took 12 minutes down. Winding mountain roads lined with aspen trees showing their first hints of autumn gold. Caleb pressed his forehead against the passenger window, breath fogging the glass as he traced patterns with his finger. They'd made this journey countless times, but conversation had become increasingly sparse since Sarah's death. "What did you say to a child who'd lost his mother? What did you say when you were still drowning in your own grief?" "Mrs. Henderson wants to talk with you after school today," Caleb said quietly, not looking away from the window. Eli's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "Everything okay? You're not in trouble, are you?" "No. She just said she wants to talk about my schoolwork and stuff." Caleb's tone carried that careful neutrality he'd perfected since his mother's passing, revealing nothing, protecting himself from further disappointment. At the school, Eli watched his son disappear into the building with barely a backward glance. Other children ran past with laughter echoing off the brick walls, backpacks bouncing, but Caleb walked with the measured steps of someone much older. Parents called greetings to each other, planning play dates and discussing weekend activities. Eli nodded politely but never lingered. Those conversations invariably turned to family activities he couldn't manage alone, or questions about how they were holding up that he didn't know how to answer. The Clearwater National Forest stretched across 30,000 acres of pristine wilderness, and Eli knew every trail, every clearing, every hidden waterfall within its boundaries. As a park ranger, he found solace in the predictability of nature, seasons changing in their appointed time, wildlife following ancient patterns, trees growing steadily toward the sky. Unlike human hearts, nature healed its wounds with patience. And time, his partner, Ranger's station supervisor Margaret Chen, was waiting with coffee and concern etched across her weathered features when he arrived at the ranger station. At 62, Margaret had seen enough life to recognize grief in all its forms, and she'd watched Eli struggle through the past 2 years with the patience of someone who understood that healing couldn't be rushed. "How's our boy doing?" she asked, settling into the chair across from his desk. "Mrs. Henderson wants to see me after school," Eli admitted, grateful for Margaret's direct way of asking about Caleb without prying too deeply. "Probably about his grades again," Margaret nodded, thoughtfully. She'd never had children of her own, but 30 years of dealing with troubled teenagers on wilderness programs had given her insights into young minds that often surprise their parents. 8-year-olds aren't supposed to carry the weight of the world, Eli. Maybe it's time to consider some of those grief counseling programs we talked about. He says he's fine, says he doesn't want to talk to strangers about Mom. And what do you say? Eli stared out the window toward the mountain peaks that surrounded their valley. I say, I don't know how to help him when I can barely help myself. The morning passed with routine patrol duties, checking campsites, maintaining trail markers, documenting wildlife sightings. But even surrounded by the natural beauty that usually centered him, Eli found his thoughts drifting to his son sitting in a classroom, probably staring out another window, probably thinking about his mother. The cycle of grief that connected them felt more like a chasm these days, keeping them isolated even when they were together. Lunch at the ranger station cafeteria meant sitting with colleagues who meant well, but didn't quite know what to say. Tom Vasquez, a newer ranger with 2 young daughters, often tried to include Eli in family activities, but every invitation felt like charity. Linda Morrison, who handled the educational programs, had lost her husband 3 years earlier and sometimes offered the knowing looks of shared experience. But her children were grown, making her grief different in ways that made Eli feel even more alone. "There's an estate sale this weekend out at the Patterson place," Tom mentioned between bites of his sandwich. "Martha's finally moving to assisted living. My wife says there's some real treasures in that house. Furniture, antiques, kids' stuff." Kids' stuff. Eli hadn't thought about adding anything new to their home since Sarah's death. Their house felt frozen in time, her coffee mug still in the dish drainer, her books still bookmarked where she'd left them. Maybe that was part of the problem. Maybe Caleb needed new things, new possibilities, instead of living in a museum of their former life. The afternoon brought a call about hikers lost on the Pinnacle Trail, and Eli found himself leading a search. A party through familiar terrain, his mind focused on the immediate task of bringing people safely home. There was something satisfying about problems with clear solutions. Find the missing hikers, guide them back to safety, ensure they had proper gear for future adventures. If only parenting came with such straightforward answers. By the time he reached Pine Valley Elementary, the parking lot was nearly empty. Mrs. Henderson, a kind woman in her 50s with the patient demeanor of someone who'd guided hundreds of children through their formative years, greeted him with a gentle smile that carried underlying concern. "Mr. Mercer, thank you for coming. Please sit down." Her classroom smelled of crayons and hand sanitizer, walls covered with colorful artwork and motivational posters. Caleb's desk sat in the 3rd row, meticulously organized in a way that would have made Sarah proud and worried in equal measure. "Caleb is a bright boy," Mrs. Henderson began, "but I'm concerned about his social isolation. He completes his work diligently, never causes problems, but he doesn't engage with other children. During recess, he sits alone. During group activities, he participates minimally. He's not unhappy, exactly, but he's not connected either." Eli shifted in the small chair, built for parent conferences, but somehow never quite comfortable for adult. "Frames, he talks to me about school, says he likes his classes. I'm sure he does. But children need more than academic success, Mr. Mercer. They need friendships, play, the messiness of childhood relationships. Caleb seems to be protecting himself from those experiences." The words hit harder than intended, probably because they reflected Eli's own approach to the world since Sarah's death. How could he encourage his son to open up to others when he'd spent 2 years doing exactly the opposite? "What do you suggest?" he asked. "Maybe some activities outside of school, sports, scouts, something that puts him around other children in a less academic setting, and perhaps consider counseling, not just for grief, but to help him develop social skills he might be missing." Driving home, Eli glanced at Caleb in the passenger seat. His son stared out the window with that same distant expression, lost in thoughts too heavy for 8-year-old shoulders. "Mrs. Henderson says you're doing well in school," Eli offered. "Yeah, she also thinks you might like to do some activities with other kids, maybe join a sports team or something." Caleb turned to look at him then, and for a moment Eli saw a flicker of the boy he used to be, curious, hopeful, eager for connection. "Would you come watch?" The question carried weight that had nothing to do with sports and everything to do with trust. Of course I'd come watch. I'd be there for every game, every practice. Mom used to say she'd come watch me play baseball when I got bigger. There it was, the minefield they navigated daily, memories of Sarah that could surface without warning, threatening to derail any progress they'd made. Eli pulled into their driveway and turned off the engine, gathering courage for honesty. "Mom would want you to play baseball if that's what you wanted. She'd want you to have friends and be happy, and do all the things kids are supposed to do, but she's not here to watch." "No, she's not, but I am." That evening, after a dinner of grilled cheese sandwiches and tomato soup, one of the few meals Eli had mastered, they sat on the front porch, watching the sun set behind the mountains. October evenings carried a crisp promise of winter, and Eli had built a small fire in their outdoor fire pit, more for comfort than warmth. "Dad," Caleb's voice came quietly through the gathering dusk. "Yeah, buddy? Do you think Mom would want us to be happy again?" The question caught Eli unprepared, though perhaps he should have expected it. 8-year-olds possessed a clarity about emotions that adults often lost in complexity and self-protection. "I think Mom would want us to be happy. I think she'd want us to take care of each other and find ways to smile again. I miss smiling," Caleb admitted. "Me too." They sat in comfortable silence, watching sparks drift upward toward the first stars. For the first time in months, Eli felt something that might have been hope stirring in his chest. Maybe Mrs. Henderson was right about activities. Maybe they both needed something new to focus on, something that would create new memories instead of constantly protecting the old ones. Saturday morning dawned clear and cool, perfect weather for an estate sale. The Patterson house sat on 5 acres of mixed woodland and meadow, the kind of property that had become increasingly rare as developers discovered their mountain valley. Martha Patterson had lived there for 60 years, raising 4 children who'd scattered across the country, leaving her to tend a house full of memories and accumulated treasures. Cars lined the gravel driveway, and people moved through the rooms and across the yard, examining furniture, dishes, books, and the countless items that accumulate over a lifetime. Eli found himself drawn, not to the antiques or collectibles, but to the evidence of family life: photo albums, children's artwork, kitchen utensils worn smooth by decades of use. Caleb stayed close to his side, overwhelmed by the crowd, but curious about the process. They'd never been to an estate sale before, and the idea of someone else's belongings finding new homes felt both sad and hopeful. "Look, Dad." Caleb tugged on his sleeve, pointing toward the edge of the property where a massive oak tree dominated. "The landscape. There's a house in that tree." Eli followed his son's gaze to see what appeared to be a substantial treehouse built into the lower branches of the ancient oak. Even from a distance, it looked more elaborate than typical backyard construction: multiple levels, real windows, and what appeared to be a small porch wrapped around the trunk. They made their way through the crowd toward the tree, drawn by curiosity and the need for space, away from the pressing mass of bargain hunters. Up close, the treehouse was even more impressive, clearly built by someone with carpentry skills and an understanding of how to work with the natural shape of the tree. But it also showed years of neglect, with weathered wood, broken shutters, and vines beginning to reclaim the structure. A small sign hung from a nail in the trunk. Treehouse, 0-20 fires. 25 cents. Caleb looked up at his father with the first genuine interest Eli had seen from him in months. Seems like a fair price, Eli agreed, though he had no idea what they'd do with a treehouse. Their own yard was too small for such an elaborate structure, and moving it seemed impossible. But something about the way Caleb was looking at the weathered wooden refuge made the decision easy. They found Martha Patterson sitting in a lawn chair near the house, a cash box in her lap, and a wistful expression on her lined face as she watched strangers carry away pieces of her life. "Mrs. Patterson, we're interested in the treehouse." She smiled, the kind of smile that held both sadness and relief. "That old thing? My husband built it for our children 40 years ago. They spent countless hours up there playing pirates and princesses and whatever children imagine. I've been wondering what would happen to it." "It looks like it was well loved," Eli said, pulling a quarter from his pocket. "Oh, it was. Even after our children outgrew it, other youngsters found their way up there. Foster children from the Hendricks place down the road used to spend time there before—" She trailed off, something clouding her expression. "Before what?" Eli asked gently. "Before they disappeared. Mia and Jake, sweet children who just vanished one night. That was 30 years ago now, but I still wonder what became of them." Caleb tugged on Eli's sleeve again. "Dad, can we really buy it?" Eli handed Martha Patterson the quarter, officially making them the owners of a treehouse they couldn't possibly move. As they shook hands, he noticed how the old woman's eyes lingered on Caleb with the recognition that comes from a lifetime of observing children. "That boy of yours has an old soul," she said quietly. "Sometimes the trees call to children who need healing." Walking back toward the treehouse, Eli wondered what exactly he'd just purchased for 25 cents, and why he felt like it might be the most important investment he'd ever made. Sunday morning arrived, with the kind of crisp clarity that made the mountains look close enough to touch. Eli had slept poorly, his mind churning over the impulsive purchase of a treehouse they couldn't move and had no practical use for. But when he found Caleb already dressed and eating breakfast at 6:30, backpack loaded with cleaning supplies he'd gathered from under the kitchen sink, Eli realized his son had been thinking about their acquisition as well. "I looked up the Patterson property online," Caleb announced with more enthusiasm than Eli had heard in his voice for months. "The treehouse is on the back part of their land, but Mrs. Patterson said we could keep it there as long as we want. She's moving to town anyway." The boy had clearly been planning. In the past 2 years, Caleb's initiative had been limited to school assignments and basic self-care, but something about the treehouse had awakened a purposefulness that reminded Eli painfully of Sarah's determination when she set her mind to a project. They drove back to the Patterson property with a borrowed ladder strapped to the roof of Eli's pickup truck, along with basic tools, trash bags, and thermoses of coffee and hot chocolate. The estate sale crowds were gone, leaving the property quiet except for the rustle of wind through changing leaves and the distant sound of a creek running somewhere beyond the tree line. The oak tree stood like a monument in the morning light, its trunk easily 6 feet in diameter and its canopy spreading wide enough to shade a small house. The treehouse itself seemed almost organic, built to follow the natural curves of the major branches, rather than imposing geometric shapes upon them. Eli could see why Mrs. Patterson's husband had chosen this location. The tree was perfectly positioned to catch both morning sun and afternoon shade, while offering views across the meadow toward the mountain ridges beyond. "It's bigger than it looked yesterday," Caleb observed, craning his neck to examine the structure above them. He was right. What had appeared to be a simple platform with walls revealed itself to be a complex construction with multiple levels, built-in benches, storage compartments, and even what looked like a small sleeping loft, accessible by a rope ladder. The craftsmanship was impressive, mortise and tenon joints, careful attention to the tree's growth patterns, and weatherproofing that had lasted decades. "Your grandfather would have loved this," Eli said, thinking of his own father's carpentry skills and the workshop where he'd learned to appreciate the satisfaction of working with wood. He always said the best projects are the ones that work with nature instead of against it. They set up the ladder and climbed carefully into the main platform. The floorboards creaked but held their weight, and Eli found himself impressed by the structural integrity despite years of neglect. Leaves had accumulated in every corner, birds had nested in the eaves, and spiderwebs draped the windows like curtains. But the basic structure remained sound. "Dad, look at this," Caleb called from the far corner where he was pulling aside a tangle of dead vines, carved deep into the wooden flooring, almost hidden beneath decades of accumulated debris, were the letters M+J forever enclosed in a roughly carved heart. The carving was amateur but heartfelt, cut deep enough into the hardwood that weather and time hadn't been able to erase it. Eli knelt beside his son, running his fingers over the carved letters. "M and J," he murmured. "Martha Patterson mentioned foster children named Mia and Jake who used to play here. The ones who disappeared? That's what she said, 30 years ago." Caleb traced the heart with his finger, his expression thoughtful in the way that meant he was processing something important. They must have really cared about each other to carve this so deep. Siblings often do, especially when they only have each other to count on. They worked through the morning, clearing out years of accumulated leaves, branches, and debris. The physical labor felt good, purposeful in a way that hiking and routine maintenance couldn't match. This was creation rather than preservation, building something new rather than simply maintaining what already existed. As they cleaned, the treehouse revealed more of its secrets. Built-in storage benches lined the walls, their hinged tops opening to reveal compartments that had stayed dry despite decades of weather. Windows fitted with real glass could still be opened and closed, though the hardware needed oil and attention. The sleeping loft was accessible by a ladder built into the wall, leading to a space just large enough for a child to curl up with a book or a pillow. This wasn't just a playhouse, Eli realized aloud. This was designed for children to actually spend time here, maybe even sleep here, like camping but safer, something like that. By noon, they had filled 6 large trash bags with debris and had uncovered most of the structure's original features. The treehouse was larger than it had appeared from the ground. The main platform was probably 12 feet by 10 feet, with the sleeping loft adding another 60 square feet of usable space. The wraparound porch was narrow but complete, offering views in 3 directions and making the structure feel more like a small cabin than a typical treehouse. "We should eat lunch," Eli suggested. But Caleb was already opening one of the built-in storage compartments, his face lighting up with discovery. "Dad, there's something in here." Eli joined his son at the storage bench, peering into the compartment that had remained sealed and relatively dry. Inside, wrapped in what had once been a plastic garbage bag, was a small bundle that had been carefully hidden away. Caleb looked up at his father with questioning eyes. "Should we open it? I think whoever left it here would want someone to find it eventually." The plastic had deteriorated with age, but the contents inside had remained protected. Eli carefully extracted what appeared to be a child's notebook, spiral, bound with a faded purple cover decorated with unicorn stickers. The pages were slightly yellowed but still intact, filled with careful handwriting in blue ink. Caleb leaned against his father's shoulder as Eli opened to the first page. "This diary belongs to Mia Catherine Foster. If you find this, and I'm not here anymore, please know that Jake and me tried to be good kids. We just wanted to stay together." The words hung between them like a prayer and a plea, carrying the weight of a child's desperate hope across 3 decades. Eli felt something shift in his chest, Not just curiosity about the missing children, but a recognition that they had stumbled into someone else's story, someone else's pain that had never found resolution. She was the one who carved the heart. Caleb said softly, "Looks like it." They sat in the filtered sunlight of the treehouse, surrounded by the evidence of their morning's work, and Eli found himself facing a decision he hadn't anticipated. They could put the diary back, seal up the compartment, and pretend they'd never found it. They could finish cleaning the treehouse and use it as the simple father-son project he'd hoped it might become. Or they could acknowledge that 25 cents had bought them more than a treehouse. It had connected them to a mystery that someone had left unsolved for 30 years. "What do you think we should do?" he asked his son. Caleb considered the question with the seriousness that had become his default approach to life. "I think Mia wanted someone to find her diary. Otherwise, why hide it where someone cleaning the treehouse would discover it? That's good reasoning. And maybe if we find out what happened to her and Jake, it would help them somehow, even if they're not still missing." Eli looked at his son, really looked at him, and saw something he'd been missing for months. Caleb wasn't just going through the motions of living anymore. The discovery of the diary had sparked something in him, a sense of purpose that transcended his own grief. Maybe Martha Patterson had been right about trees calling to children who needed healing. "Then I guess we have some research to do," Eli said, closing the diary carefully and tucking it into his jacket pocket. As they packed up their cleaning supplies and prepared to leave, Eli felt the treehouse watching them go. It was a fanciful thought, but the place seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting to see whether they would return. The carved heart on the floor caught the afternoon light, a reminder that M and J had found refuge here once upon a time, before whatever happened to them happened. Driving home, Caleb stared out the window with an expression that reminded Eli of the boy he used to be, thoughtful but engaged, sad but not defeated. They had found something together in the treehouse, something more important than a building project or a way to spend time. They had found purpose. That evening, as Eli tucked the diary into his own nightstand drawer next to Sarah's wedding ring, he realized that for the first time in 2 years, he was looking forward to tomorrow. Not because his grief had magically disappeared, but because he and his son had something to do together, something that mattered to someone besides themselves. The treehouse had given them a mystery to solve, but more importantly, it had given them a reason to solve it together. The following Saturday found Eli and Caleb back at the treehouse with sandwiches, tools, and a sense of mission that had carried them through the week. Caleb had been different since their discovery. More talkative at dinner, more engaged with his homework, more present in ways that reminded Eli of the boy he'd been before Sarah's illness consumed their lives. They had spent the weekday evenings reading Mia's diary together, taking turns with the careful handwriting that told the story of a 12-year-old girl trying to make sense of a world that kept moving her from home to home. The entries began optimistically, full of hope that the next placement would be different, that she and Jake would finally find people who wanted to keep them. Entries number 3, Caleb read aloud as they sat on the treehouse platform, the diary open between them. "The new house has a big kitchen, and Mrs. Hendricks says I can help cook dinner sometimes. Jake likes his room, and there's a woods behind the house, where we can explore. Maybe this time will be better." The early entries painted a picture of 2 siblings clinging to each other while navigating the foster care system. Mia wrote about Jake's nightmares, his difficulty trusting adults, his fierce protectiveness of her, despite being only 10 years old himself. She described their previous placements, homes where they were unwanted burdens, families who took foster children for the monthly payments, people who meant well but couldn't handle 2 traumatized kids who refused to be separated. "Listen to this one," Eli said, finding an entry that had caught his attention the night before. Entry number 12. "Jake found this treehouse today while we were walking in the woods. It's perfect, big enough for both of us, and nobody else knows about. Jake says we can come here when the Hendricks get tired of us. I told him that's not going to happen, but I like having a secret place that's just ours. Working on the treehouse while reading about its previous occupants created an odd intimacy with children they'd never met. Every board they cleaned, every repair they made, connected them more deeply to Mia and Jake's story. The structure became a character in their research, a witness to whatever had happened to the siblings who had claimed it as their refuge. Under one of the storage benches, Caleb discovered something they had missed during their initial cleaning, a small wooden box carefully wedged into a gap between two support beams. Inside, wrapped in an old t-shirt, was a collection of treasures that told the story of two children trying to build a life for themselves. A broken compass with Jake scratched into its metal case, several smooth river rocks, a plastic bag containing $43 in crumpled bills, and a photograph of two children standing in front of a Christmas tree. The photograph showed a girl with dark hair and serious eyes standing protectively, next to a smaller boy whose smile looked forced. Even in the faded colors of the old snapshot, their resemblance was clear. The same angular face, the same way of standing as if ready to run. On the back, someone had written Mia and Jake, Christmas 1993, in careful cursive. This was the year before they disappeared, Eli realized, checking the dates in the diary entries. They would have been 12 and 10. Caleb studied the photograph, with the intensity he usually reserved for difficult math problems. They look scared, he said finally, like they're trying to be happy but can't quite manage it. Foster care is hard, even in good homes. They'd learned not to get too attached to anything. Is that why they made this place? So they'd have something that belonged to them? I think so. The broken compass became their focus for the afternoon. Jake's name was carved into the metal with the same amateur technique that had created the heart on the floor, suggesting he had done both carvings. The compass needle spun freely, but didn't point north, symbolic in a way that made Eli's chest tighten with sympathy for a 10-year-old boy who had lost his sense of direction long before his compass broke. We could fix this, Caleb suggested, turning the compass over in his hands. There's a shop in town that repairs old instruments. We could, Eli agreed, though he wondered if fixing Jake's compass 30 years too late qualified as meaningful action or empty gesture. As they continued reading, the diary entries began to change tone. Mia's initial optimism about the Hendricks family gave way to worry, then fear, then a desperate kind of vigilance that no 12-year-old should have to develop. Entry 28. Mr. Hendricks came to my room again last night to check on me. I told Jake and he wants to run away, but I said we have to be smart about it. If we run, they'll just find us and split us up for sure. But if we stay and something bad happens, they might split us up anyway. I don't know what to do. Eli felt his hands clench around the diary. Even 30 years later, Mia's words carried the weight of a child trying to navigate adult dangers she shouldn't have had to understand. The entries that followed painted a picture of escalating fear, careful planning, and two children preparing to protect themselves the only way they knew how. Maybe we should take a break from reading, he suggested, noticing how quiet Caleb had become. No, his son said firmly. We need to know what happened to them. Someone should know their whole story. The diary revealed that Mia and Jake had been planning to run away, but not randomly. They had been stockpiling supplies in the treehouse, canned food stolen from the kitchen, blankets, matches, the money they had found hidden in the diary box. The treehouse wasn't just their refuge, it was their escape plan. Entry 34. Jake practiced the route to town 3 times this week. It's 4 miles through the woods, but he thinks we can do it at night if we have to. I packed our birth certificates and the picture of our mom. If we can get to town, maybe we can find someone to help us. Maybe we can find our mom's sister in Denver like we talked about. They were trying to find family, Caleb observed. Real family. Sounds like it. Working while reading created a rhythm that felt almost like meditation. Sand, clean, repair, discover. With each task, they uncovered more evidence of Mia and Jake's presence, initials carved in unexpected places, small improvements to the structure that showed they had spent considerable time there, wear patterns on the floorboards that mapped their movements through the space. The sleeping loft showed the most evidence of regular use. The wooden platform was worn smooth in the center where someone had slept repeatedly, and scratched into the wall were dozens of small marks, apparently a way of counting days or nights. Eli counted them twice and came up with 87 marks, suggesting the children had spent nearly 3 months using the treehouse as a regular retreat. They were living here part-time, he realized. This wasn't just a hideout. This was their real home. By evening, they had made significant progress on both the physical restoration and their understanding of Mia and Jake's story. The treehouse was beginning to look like the refuge it had been designed to be, and the diary was revealing the complex circumstances that had driven 2 children to create their own sanctuary in the woods. Driving home, as the sun set behind the mountains, Caleb asked the question that had been building all day. "Dad, what do you think really happened to them?" Eli had been wondering the same thing. The diary entries stopped abruptly after entry 34, with no explanation or farewell. Either Mia had simply stopped writing, or something had happened that prevented her from continuing her record. "I don't know yet," he admitted, "but I think we need to find out. How? Research, police records, newspaper archives. Maybe there are people still around who remember what happened." For the first time since Sarah's death, Eli found himself making plans that extended beyond the immediate necessities of daily survival. The mystery of Mia and Jake had given him and Caleb something to work toward together, something that required both investigation and action. More importantly, it had given them a way to connect with each other that didn't require them to talk about their own loss or their own struggles with moving forward. That night, as he placed the diary back in his nightstand drawer next to Sarah's wedding ring, Eli realized that helping 2 long-lost foster children find peace might be exactly what he and his son needed to find their own way back to each other. The Pine Valley Public Library occupied a converted Victorian house on Main Street, its rooms lined with mismatched bookshelves and the comfortable clutter of a community institution that had grown organically over decades. Eli had visited occasionally to research trail conditions or wildlife management, but he'd never ventured into the local history section tucked away in what had once been the house's back parlor. Eleanor Martinez, the head librarian, had worked at the library for 35 years and possessed the kind of institutional memory that made her invaluable for exactly the kind of research Eli and Caleb needed to undertake. When Eli explained their interest in the missing foster children from 1994, her expression shifted from professional helpfulness to personal investment. "Mia and Jake," she said without hesitation. "I remember them. They came in here regularly. That last summer, always together, always polite. Mia was working her way through the entire young adult section, and Jake loved the nature guides. They had library cards under their foster placement, but they never caused any trouble." She led them to a corner table and began pulling resources, newspaper archives on microfilm, city directories, phone books from the 1990s. The local newspaper, the Pine Valley Courier, had covered the disappearance extensively, at least initially. July 15th, 1994, Eleanor read from the first article. 2 foster children, ages 12 and 10, were reported missing from their placement home after failing to return from an afternoon walk. Local authorities organized search parties to comb the surrounding forest, but no trace of the children has been found. The newspaper coverage painted a frustrating picture of a case that had generated initial concern, but quickly faded from public attention. The first articles treated the disappearance as a likely runaway situation. Troubled foster children who had decided to leave on their own. Later articles mentioned search efforts being scaled back due to lack of evidence and the assumption that the children had left the area entirely. "Look at this," Caleb pointed to a follow-up article dated 2 weeks later. Police Chief Robert Martinez says the investigation remains active, but with no leads or evidence of foul play, resources are being redirected to other cases. Martinez is my uncle, Eleanor explained. He retired about 10 years ago, but he always regretted not being able to solve that case. He felt like the system had failed those children twice, once by not protecting them in their placement, and again by not finding them when they disappeared. The newspaper articles mentioned the Hendricks family only briefly, describing them as devastated by the children's disappearance and cooperating fully with authorities. There were no details about the circumstances that might have prompted Mia and Jake to run away, no investigation into whether their foster home had been appropriate or safe. "Can we talk to your uncle?" Eli asked. "I'm sure he'd be happy to meet with you. He still lives here in town. But I should warn you, he's never gotten over the feeling that there was more to that case than anyone wanted to investigate." While Eleanor made copies of the newspaper articles, Caleb discovered something else in the library's collection, a thin folder labeled Missing Persons, Unsolved Cases, that contained police reports, search documentation, and witness statements. From the Mia and Jake investigation, the official reports were more detailed than the newspaper coverage, but they raised as many questions as they answered. Mia and Jake had left their foster home on July 12, 1994, telling Mrs. Hendricks they were going for a walk in the woods. When they hadn't returned by dark, she had called the police. The initial search focused on the areas immediately around the Hendricks property, but had been expanded when no trace of the children was found. What struck Eli as odd was the timeline. According to Mia's diary, they had been using the treehouse as a regular retreat for months, but none of the search documentation mentioned the treehouse or the Patterson property, even though it was less than 2 miles from the Hendricks home. "Look at this witness statement," Eli said, showing Caleb a page from the police file. "Mrs. Patterson reported seeing lights in her woods occasionally during the summer, but she assumed it was teenagers or campers. She mentioned it to police during the search, but they didn't follow up because the lights had stopped appearing after the children went missing." Because Mia and Jake were the ones making the lights, Caleb realized, and when they disappeared, the lights stopped. They spent the afternoon assembling a timeline that painted a clearer picture of Mia and Jake's last weeks. The diary entries, combined with the police reports and newspaper coverage, suggested that the children had been spending increasing amounts of time at the treehouse as conditions at their foster home deteriorated. Their disappearance hadn't been impulsive. It had been the culmination of months of careful planning, but something had gone wrong. If their plan had worked, they would have made it to town, contacted authorities, or reached the relative in Denver that Mia had mentioned. Instead, they had simply vanished, leaving behind their carefully hoarded supplies and the diary that documented their fears and hopes. Eleanor's uncle, retired Police Chief Robert Martinez, lived in a tidy ranch house on the edge of town with a view of the mountains and a workshop where he restored antique furniture. At 72, he moved with the deliberate care of someone whose joints reminded him daily of decades of physical work. But his eyes remained sharp, and his memory of the case was precise. "Those children haunted me," he admitted, settling into a comfortable chair in his living room while his wife brought coffee and homemade cookies. "In 30 years of police work, I solved most of my cases, but Mia and Jake just disappeared like smoke. No trace, no clues, no resolution." He pulled out a file folder that looked like it had been handled frequently over the years. "I kept copies of everything, even after I retired. Call it professional stubbornness or personal guilt, but I couldn't let it go." The file contained photographs of the search efforts, additional witness statements, and detailed maps showing the areas that had been covered. Eli studied the search patterns and confirmed his earlier suspicion. The treehouse area had been excluded from the intensive search because it was on private property, and the owners hadn't reported any signs of the children. Did you ever investigate the foster home? Eli asked carefully. Robert's expression darkened. Officially, yes. Unofficially, I was told to focus on the runaway angle and not waste time pursuing allegations that couldn't be proven. The Hendricks family had been taking foster children for years, and there had never been any formal complaints. But you suspected something? I suspected a lot of things, but suspicion isn't evidence. And I was a small-town police chief with limited resources and pressure to keep the case simple. Runaway foster children are unfortunately common. Missing children who've been murdered are thankfully rare. The system encouraged me to assume the former rather than investigate the latter. Caleb had been quiet during the adult conversation, but now he spoke up. We found their treehouse and Mia's diary. Robert leaned forward with interest. You found what? Eli explained their discovery of the treehouse and the diary, describing the supplies Mia and Jake had stockpiled and the evidence that they had been using the structure as a regular refuge. As he spoke, Robert's expression shifted. From curiosity to excitement to regret. They had a base camp, the retired police chief said finally. They weren't just running blindly. They had a plan and a place to execute it. If I'd known about that treehouse 30 years ago, the entire investigation would have been different. Different how? Different because it would have given us a place to start looking for evidence. Different because it would have proven they were more organized than we thought. Different because it might have led us to answers instead of just more questions. That evening, driving home with copies of the police files and a promise from Robert Martinez to help with their investigation, Eli found himself thinking about the nature of unsolved mysteries. For 30 years, Mia and Jake's disappearance had remained a puzzle with missing pieces. But those pieces hadn't been lost. They had been hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to ask the right questions and look in the right places. Caleb fell asleep in the passenger seat, exhausted by a day of research and revelation, but his face looked peaceful, in a way that reminded Eli of the boy he used to be before grief had aged him beyond his years. The mystery of Mia and Jake was giving his son something to care about beyond his own pain. And for that alone, Eli was grateful they had stumbled into this strange investigation. As he carried Caleb into the house and tucked him into bed, Eli realized that they were no longer just restoring a treehouse or satisfying curiosity about its previous occupants. They were trying to solve a case that had haunted a good man for 3 decades, and in doing so, they were finding their way back to the kind of purposeful living that Sarah would have wanted for both of them. That night, as he placed Mia's diary in the nightstand drawer next to Sarah's wedding ring, Eli found himself making a silent promise to 2 children he'd never met. Somehow, they would find the truth about what had happened in those woods 30 years ago. The Pine Valley County Courthouse maintained its records in a basement archive that smelled of old paper and institutional cleaning supplies. Getting access required forms, identification, and the kind of bureaucratic patience that Eli had developed during years of dealing with federal park service requirements. But the effort was worthwhile. The foster care files from the 1990s told a story that the newspaper articles and police reports had only hinted at. Mia Catherine Foster and Jake Michael Foster had been in the system for 3 years before their placement with the Hendricks family. Their mother had died in a car accident when Jake was 7, and with no known father and no relatives willing or able to take them, they had become wards of the state. The files documented a heartbreaking progression through multiple homes, families who couldn't handle Jake's behavioral issues, placements where Mia's fierce protectiveness of her brother was seen as problematic, homes where they were simply unwanted burdens being shuffled along to someone else's responsibility. "Look at this," Caleb said, reading over his father's shoulder as they sat at a small table in the archives. They were separated twice before the Hendricks placement, once for 6 months when Mia was 10. The file contained psychological evaluations, that painted a picture of two traumatized children clinging to each other as their only source of stability in an unstable world. Jake struggled with nightmares, bedwetting, and explosive anger that made him difficult to place. Mia had developed what the reports called parentification behaviors, taking responsibility for Jake's care and emotional well-being in ways that were both touching and concerning. The system failed them, Eli realized, reading through placement after placement that had ended in disruption. Every time they started to settle somewhere, something went wrong, and they got moved again. The Hendricks family file was thicker than the others, suggesting they had been taking foster children for several years. Richard and Carol Hendricks had been licensed foster parents since 1989, primarily taking sibling groups that other families found difficult to place. On paper, they looked like ideal placements: a stable marriage, adequate income, experience with challenging children. But buried in the routine paperwork were subtle red flags that became more obvious in retrospect. Multiple children had been removed from their care over the years, always for vague reasons like incompatibility or changed family circumstances. There were no allegations of abuse, but there was a pattern of placements that began optimistically and ended with children being transferred to other homes. "Here's something interesting," Eli said, finding a document he almost missed. Jake was hospitalized during his placement with the Hendricks family. Emergency room visit in June 1994, about a month before they disappeared. The hospital record was brief. Treatment for a dislocated shoulder that Jake claimed happened when he fell from a tree. The attending physician had noted some inconsistencies in the story, but hadn't pursued them, treating the injury and releasing the boy back to his foster parents. "Mia would have known Jake didn't fall from any tree," Caleb observed. "She would have known exactly what happened to him." The pieces were beginning to form a picture that made Eli's chest tighten with anger and sadness. Two children who had already suffered too much trauma, placed with a family that presented well to the authorities, but may have been harming them in private. Their increasing use of the treehouse as a refuge made perfect sense. They were preparing to protect themselves the only way they knew how. But the files also revealed something else. Mia and Jake hadn't been the Hendricks' only foster children. To disappear. 2 years before Mia and Jake arrived, another sibling pair had been placed with them. Siblings who had run away after 3 months and were never found. The case had been classified as runaways who had likely left the state. But the pattern was troubling. "That's 4 children who disappeared from the same foster home," Eli said, showing Caleb the earlier case file. "Tommy and Lisa Brennan, ages 9 and 11, reported as runaways in March 1992. Do you think they're connected?" "I think it's too much of a coincidence to ignore." They spent the rest of the morning copying documents and making notes, building a timeline that stretched back further than they had originally intended. The Hendricks family pattern suggested something more systematic than individual incidents. Foster children who disappeared without trace, investigations that focused on runaway scenarios rather than exploring other possibilities, cases that were closed without resolution. At lunch, they met with Robert Martinez at a diner on Main Street, spreading their research across a corner booth while they ate sandwiches and tried to make sense of what they had discovered. 4 children, Robert said, studying their timeline. 4 children disappeared from the same foster home over a 3-year period, and nobody connected the dots. Would connecting the dots have made a difference? Eli asked. It would have. Triggered a different kind of investigation. Multiple disappearances from the same location isn't a series of runaways. It's a pattern that suggests something more serious. Robert had brought his own research to lunch, a collection of notes and memories from 30 years of thinking about the case. He had tracked down several former foster children who had been placed with the Hendricks family and later removed, and their stories painted a consistent picture of a home where appearances and reality were very different things. Richard Hendricks, was what we'd call a manipulator, Robert explained. Charming with adults, intimidating with children. He knew exactly how to present himself to social workers and investigators, but the children told different stories. What kind of different stories? Inappropriate touching, threats, punishments that crossed the line into abuse. But it was always one child's word against two adults with clean records and good reputations. The system was set up to protect the adults, not the children. The conversation was interrupted by Caleb, who had been quiet throughout lunch, but was now staring out the diner window with an expression that Eli had learned to recognize as deep thought. "Dad," Caleb said quietly, "I've been having dreams about Mia." Eli felt something cold settle in his stomach. "What kind of dreams?" "She's trying to tell me something, but I can't understand what she's saying. She keeps pointing toward the trees and looking scared. Last night, she was holding Jake's hand, and they were both pointing at the same place." Robert leaned forward with interest. "Pointing where?" "I don't know. Somewhere in the woods near the treehouse, but they look like they really want me to find something." Eli wanted to dismiss his son's dreams as the natural result of spending so much time thinking about Mia and Jake, but something in Caleb's tone made him hesitate. The boy wasn't dramatic or attention-seeking. He was describing the dreams with the same matter-of-fact precision he brought to his schoolwork. "Dreams can be our minds trying to process information," Robert said carefully. "Sometimes when we're working on a problem, our subconscious picks up patterns that our conscious minds miss." That afternoon, they returned to the treehouse with a new sense of purpose. If Mia and Jake had been preparing to expose what was happening at their foster home, they might have gathered evidence. And if they had been using the treehouse as their base of operations, that evidence might still be hidden somewhere in the structure or the surrounding area. The treehouse revealed new secrets as they searched with more systematic attention. In the sleeping loft, Caleb discovered a loose board that concealed another hiding space, this one containing what appeared to be official documents wrapped in multiple layers of plastic. The papers were yellowed and brittle, but still legible. Photocopies of foster care records, medical reports, and what looked like financial documents related to the foster care system. They were building a case, Eli realized, studying the documents. Mia was documenting everything, not just her own experiences, but the experiences of other foster children who had been placed with the Hendricks family. Among the papers was a hand-drawn map that showed not just the treehouse and surrounding woods, but several other locations marked with symbols and notes. Some of the locations were labeled with initials, TB and LB at a spot near the creek, MF and JF at another location deeper in the woods. "Tommy and Lisa Brennan," Caleb said, pointing to the first set of initials, "and Mia Foster and Jake Foster. It's a map of burial sites," Eli said, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. The map revealed the truth that had eluded investigators for 30 years. The foster children hadn't run away. They had been murdered, and their bodies had been buried in the woods surrounding the treehouse that had served as their final refuge. Mia and Jake had discovered what had happened to Tommy and Lisa, and they had been preparing to expose the truth when they became victims themselves. As the sun began to set through the canopy above them, Eli and Caleb sat in the treehouse holding evidence that could finally bring justice to 4 murdered children. But they also realized that their investigation had moved beyond simple curiosity about the treehouse's previous occupants. They were now in possession of information that someone had killed to keep secret, and that same someone might still be alive and dangerous. "We need to call Robert Martinez," Eli said, carefully rewrapping the documents. "And we need to be very careful about who else knows what we've found." Caleb nodded solemnly, understanding instinctively that their investigation had entered more serious territory. But as they prepared to leave the treehouse, he paused to touch the carved heart on the floor. Mia and Jake's declaration of love for each other that had survived 3 decades. "We're going to help them," he promised quietly. "We're going to make sure people know what happened to them." Driving home with the evidence carefully secured in Eli's truck, both father and son understood that their project had evolved far beyond restoration and research. They were now the advocates for 4 children who had been failed by the system that was supposed to protect them, and they carried the responsibility of ensuring that Mia, Jake, Tommy, and Lisa finally received the justice they had died trying to obtain. Robert Martinez arrived at the treehouse within an hour of Eli's phone call, bringing with him the current Pine Valley Police Chief, Detective Sarah Chen, and a crime scene photographer. The discovery of what appeared to be evidence in a 30-year-old murder case had transformed their amateur investigation into an official police matter, but Robert's involvement ensured that Eli and Caleb remained part of the process rather than being excluded from it. "This changes everything," Detective Chen said after examining the documents and the hand-drawn map. "If these locations are accurate, we're looking at multiple homicides, not missing persons cases." The storm shelter map that Mia had drawn with careful precision showed not only the burial sites marked with initials, but also a network of hiding places throughout the woods, storm drains, abandoned root cellars, even a cave system that extended under the Patterson property. It was the work of children who had learned to think like prey, always planning escape routes and safe havens. "She was 12 years old," Eli said, studying the map's sophisticated detail. 12 years old and planning like a military strategist because she knew her life depended on it. The most chilling discovery was a series of dates written in the map's margins, dates that corresponded to the disappearances of Tommy and Lisa Brennan, and what appeared to be planned dates for Mia and Jake's own escape attempt. The final date on the map was July 15th, 1994, 3 days after Mia and Jake had disappeared. They were going to run that night, Caleb realized. July 15th was when they planned to leave for good. But something went wrong 3 days earlier, Detective Chen observed. The question is what? While the police team began the process of organizing a proper search of the burial sites indicated on Mia's map, Eli found himself thinking about the logistics of their investigation. Someone had murdered 4 children over a 3-year period and successfully concealed the crimes for 30 years. That person had to be someone with detailed knowledge of the local area, someone who understood how the foster care system worked, and someone who had enough authority or influence to ensure that investigations remained superficial. "Richard Hendricks," he said to Robert, as they stood watching the crime scene team work. "He's the common factor in all 4 disappearances." "Richard Hendricks died 8 years ago," Robert replied. "Heart attack. But he had family, a son who would be in his 40s now. David Hendricks, lives about 10 miles from here, runs a construction business." The name sent a chill through Eli. Construction work would explain knowledge of burial sites, excavation techniques, and how to conceal evidence in remote locations. It would also provide access to heavy equipment and the kind of local knowledge necessary for the crimes they were investigating. Has anyone talked to David Hendricks about his father's foster children? Not in 30 years. He was questioned briefly when Mia and Jake first disappeared, but only as a routine interview. He had an alibi, was working a construction job in the next county that week. As the afternoon progressed, the police search began to yield results that confirmed Mia's map. Ground-penetrating radar detected anomalies at 2 of the sites she had marked, and excavation revealed what appeared to be human remains that had been buried for decades. The discovery transformed the investigation from cold case review to active homicide inquiry, with all the resources and attention that designation commanded. But it also meant that word of the discovery would spread through the small community, potentially alerting anyone who might have been involved in the original crimes. Caleb had been unusually quiet during the police activity, sitting in the treehouse with Mia's diary while the official investigation proceeded below. When Eli climbed up to check on him, He found his son staring at a page in the diary with an expression of concern that went beyond his usual seriousness. "Dad, look at this entry," Caleb said, showing him a page they had read before but hadn't fully understood. Entry 31. "Jake says David has been watching us when we walk to the treehouse. I told him he's being paranoid, but today I saw the truck. 2. White pickup with the construction company logo. Why would he care where we go?" The entry was dated July 10th, 1994, 2 days before Mia and Jake disappeared. They had been aware they were being watched, and they had identified their observer as David Hendricks. "They knew he was following them," Eli said, feeling pieces of the puzzle clicking into place. "Mia documented it in her diary, and if David knew they were going to the treehouse, he would have known they might find evidence about Tommy and Lisa." The implications were chilling. David Hendricks hadn't just inherited his father's construction business. He had inherited his father's secrets and his father's methods for keeping them hidden. When Mia and Jake had threatened to expose the truth about the previous disappearances, David had eliminated them the same way his father had eliminated Tommy and Lisa 2 years earlier. Detective Chen joined them in the treehouse, her expression grim. "We've confirmed human remains at both sites indicated on the map. Based on the positioning and condition, we're looking at 4 victims, probably children or young adolescents, buried approximately 25 to 30 years ago. What happens now?" Eli asked. "Now we build a case. We have evidence. We have suspects, and we have enough probable cause to obtain search warrants. But I need to ask you and your son to step back and let us handle the investigation from here. This has become a multiple homicide case, and there may be ongoing danger." As if summoned by her words, the sound of a vehicle approaching through the woods interrupted their conversation. Through the treehouse windows, they could see a white pickup truck with construction company logos on the doors, driving slowly along the dirt access road that led to the treehouse clearing. "That's him," Caleb said quietly. "That's the truck Mia wrote about." Detective Chen immediately radioed for backup while positioning herself between the treehouse and the approaching vehicle. But David Hendricks parked his truck and climbed out slowly, his hands visible and his demeanor suggesting someone who had come to talk rather than to threaten. At 48, David Hendricks looked like what he was, a successful contractor, with the weathered hands and steady build of someone who had spent his adult life in physical work. But there was something in his expression that reminded Eli of the descriptions they had read of his father, a calculated charm that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Heard there was some excitement out here today," David called out, his tone conversational. "Police cars, crime scene tape, makes a man curious about what's going on in his old neighborhood." "This is a police investigation, Mr. Hendricks." "Detective," Chen replied formally. "I'm going to need to ask you to leave the area." "Oh, I'm not trying to interfere. Just wanted to make sure nobody was getting hurt poking around in places that might be dangerous. These old woods can be treacherous. Sinkholes, unstable ground, that sort of thing." The warning was delivered with a smile, but the message was clear. David Hendricks knew exactly what they had found, and he was letting them know that he considered their discovery a threat to his security. From the treehouse, Eli watched the confrontation unfold with growing understanding of how the murders had remained unsolved for 30 years. The Hendricks family had operated with confidence that their crimes would never be discovered, and they had maintained that confidence by ensuring that anyone who threatened to expose them simply disappeared. But Mia's map had survived, hidden, in a treehouse that David probably assumed had been searched and cleared decades ago. Her careful documentation of burial sites and her systematic collection of evidence had finally provided the key to solving not just her own murder, but the murders of 3 other children who had been forgotten by everyone except the man who had killed them. As backup officers arrived and David Hendricks was escorted away for questioning, Eli realized that their simple treehouse restoration project had uncovered one of the most significant criminal cases in the county's history. More importantly, it had given 4 murdered children the justice they had died trying to obtain. That evening, as crime scene investigators continued their work under portable lights, Eli and Caleb finally understood why the treehouse had seemed to call to them. It hadn't just been a refuge for foster children, it had been a repository of evidence that someone desperately needed to find. The revelation came 3 days later, delivered by Detective Chen in Robert Martinez's living room, with the weight of someone who had spent decades in law enforcement and thought she had seen everything the human capacity for evil could produce. But the evidence uncovered in David Hendricks's house and business records had revealed a conspiracy that stretched far beyond a single family's crimes. "We found the adoption papers," Detective Chen said, spreading photocopied documents across Robert's coffee table. Forged documents showing that Tommy, Lisa, Mia, and Jake had been legally adopted by families in other states, complete with fake signatures, official seals, and financial records showing adoption fees being paid. Eli studied the papers with growing horror. The documents were sophisticated forgeries that would have fooled casual inspection, complete with letterheads from legitimate adoption agencies and legal firms that actually existed. But more disturbing were the financial records that accompanied them. Bank deposits totaling tens of thousands of dollars, payments that had been made to accounts controlled by Richard and David Hendricks. They were selling the children, Eli realized. The foster care placement was just a way to acquire inventory. "It gets worse," Detective Chen continued. "We've identified at least 12 other children who passed through the Hendricks care over a 10-year period. Most of them have legitimate paper trails showing successful placements with other families, but 4 of them have no verifiable records after leaving the Hendricks home." Robert leaned forward, his face pale. "How many victims are we talking about?" "Potentially 8 children over a decade. 4 we can prove were murdered and buried on the property. 4 others who may have been successfully sold to buyers who were told they were legitimate private adoptions." The scope of the operation was staggering. Richard Hendricks had used his position as a licensed foster parent to acquire children that the system considered difficult to place. Sibling groups, older children, kids with behavioral issues that made them less desirable to legitimate adoptive families. He had then either sold them to buyers who were willing to pay premium prices for children with no questions asked, or eliminated them when they became too much of a risk to the operation. The children who fought back or threatened to expose the operation were killed, Detective Chen explained. The compliant ones were sold to families who may not have even known they were participating in something illegal. But in either case, the children disappeared from official records and were never seen again. Caleb had been listening to the adult conversation with the focused attention he brought to everything involving Mia and Jake. Now he spoke up with a question that cut to the heart of the conspiracy. Who were the buyers? Someone had to be willing to pay for children. That's what we're working on now. David Hendricks kept meticulous records, probably as insurance against his buyers or as evidence he could use if he ever got caught. We've identified several couples who purchased children through the operation, most of them believing they were participating in legitimate private adoptions. The detective's next revelation was the most shocking of all. Among David Hendricks' records was a ledger that detailed not just the adoption sales, but also a network of similar operations in other states. The Hendricks family had been part of a regional conspiracy that trafficked foster children across state lines, using legitimate placement agencies as cover for what amounted to organized child trafficking. Richard Hendricks wasn't just a foster parent who went bad, Detective Chen said. He was part of a network that may have been responsible for the disappearance of hundreds of children over 20 years. The scope of the conspiracy explained how the murders had remained undetected for so long. Children who disappeared from the foster care system were often assumed to be runaways, especially if they were older, or had histories of behavioral problems. The system was designed to track children through official placements, not to investigate when they vanished entirely from official records. But Mia's intelligence and determination had threatened the entire operation. Her systematic documentation of the Hendricks activities, combined with her discovery of Tommy and Lisa's burial site, had provided evidence that could have exposed not just their murders, but the entire trafficking network. She had been killed, not just to prevent her from reporting abuse at her foster home, but to protect a criminal enterprise that generated hundreds of thousands of dollars annually. The adoption papers we found show that Mia and Jake were scheduled to be adopted by a family in Arizona, Detective Chen continued. But something went wrong with the arrangement, and instead of being transferred, they were murdered and buried with the other children. Eli felt sick thinking about 12-year-old Mia, trying to protect her little brother while unknowingly documenting evidence of their own planned sale or execution. The diary entries that had seemed like the fears of a traumatized child were actually the observations of someone who had stumbled into the middle of a criminal conspiracy and was trying to survive long enough to expose it. She knew, Caleb said quietly. Mia knew they were in more danger than just an abusive foster home. That's why she was so systematic about gathering evidence. She was trying to build a case that would be strong enough to protect other children. As the investigation continued, more details emerged about the network's operations. The legitimate adoption agencies had been infiltrated by employees who facilitated the illegal placements, creating paperwork that would satisfy cursory official review while hiding the true nature of the transactions. Foster care social workers had been paid to overlook irregularities and approve placements that should have raised red flags. Most disturbing was the discovery that the network had continued operating even after Richard Hendricks' death. David Hendricks had inherited not just his father's construction business, but also his father's role in the trafficking operation. The murders had stopped, but the illegal adoptions had continued, with David serving as a broker between desperate families and children who had been systematically removed from legitimate oversight. "We've arrested 6 people so far," Detective Chen reported. David Hendricks, 2 social workers, an adoption agency administrator, and 2 individuals who purchased children through the network. But this is just the beginning. We expect the investigation to expand into multiple states and involve federal agencies. That evening, as Eli and Caleb sat in their own living room, processing the magnitude of what they had uncovered, both father and son struggled to understand how their simple treehouse project had revealed such extensive criminality. "Mia saved a lot of children," Caleb said finally. "Even though she couldn't save herself, her evidence is going to help all those other kids." Eli nodded, thinking about the 12-year-old girl who had faced unimaginable evil with courage and intelligence that most adults would struggle to match. Her diary had been more than a record of her experiences. It had been a deliberate effort to create evidence that would survive even if she didn't. She knew someone would eventually find the treehouse, he realized. She hid her evidence where she knew it would be discovered, even if it took 30 years. The plot twist had transformed their understanding of everything they thought they knew about Mia and Jake's story. They hadn't been simply 2 foster children fleeing an abusive home. They had been witnesses to a criminal conspiracy who had died trying to expose it. Their treehouse hadn't been just a refuge. It had been a command center where a 12-year-old girl had conducted an investigation that would ultimately bring down a network of child traffickers. But the most profound realization was that Mia's plan had finally worked. Her carefully hidden evidence had found the right people at the right time, and her death would finally mean something more than just another tragedy in the foster care system. She had achieved what she died trying to accomplish. She had protected other children from the fate that she and Jake couldn't escape. The FBI task force arrived in Pine Valley on a Tuesday morning in early November. transforming the small mountain town into the center of what would become one of the largest child trafficking investigations in regional history. Agent Patricia Valdez, a specialist in crimes against children with 20 years of federal law enforcement experience, set up operations in the community center and began coordinating with local authorities to expand the investigation across state lines. Eli and Caleb found themselves at the center of a media storm they hadn't anticipated. The story of a father and son discovering evidence of multiple murders while restoring a treehouse had captured national attention, bringing reporters and television crews to their quiet mountain community. But more importantly, it had prompted other families to come forward with information about suspicious adoptions and missing foster children dating back decades. We've identified 43 potential victims across 6 states, Agent Valdez explained during a briefing that included Eli, Caleb, Robert Martinez, and Detective Chen. Children who entered foster care systems and then disappeared from official records, often with paperwork suggesting they had been adopted by families that either don't exist or deny any knowledge of the adoption. The scope of the network continued to expand as investigators followed the financial trails and communications records found in David Hendricks' files. The operation had been more sophisticated than anyone had initially realized, involving corrupt officials at multiple levels of government, legitimate businesses that served as money laundering operations, and a customer base that included wealthy families who had been willing to pay premium prices for children with no questions asked. But the investigation had also revealed something that gave Eli hope for the victims who had survived. Several of the children who had been sold through the network had been placed with families who genuinely believed they were participating in legitimate adoptions. These families had provided loving homes for children who might otherwise have been murdered, and many of the now adult victims were cooperating with investigators to help identify other survivors. Mia's documentation has been crucial, Agent Valdez continued. Her records correlate with financial transactions we've found in the suspect's accounts, and her timeline helps us understand how the operation evolved over the years she was observing it. The FBI had reconstructed Mia's final weeks using her diary entries, the documents she had hidden in the treehouse, and evidence recovered from the crime scenes. The picture that emerged was of a 12-year-old girl conducting surveillance operations with the methodical patience of a trained investigator, documenting patterns of behavior and building a case file that would have impressed professional law enforcement officers. She identified at least 6 other children who had passed through the Hendricks home before her and Jake arrived, Agent Valdez explained. She tracked license plates of vehicles that came to pick up children in the middle of the night. She even documented conversations she overheard between Richard Hendricks and his contacts in other states. But Mia's investigation had also put her and Jake in extreme danger. David Hendricks had been monitoring the treehouse, probably on his father's instructions, and had realized that the children were gathering evidence that could expose the entire operation. The decision to kill them had been made when Mia's surveillance activities became too sophisticated to ignore. The final entry in her diary is dated July 12, 1994. Agent Valdez said, reading from a photocopy of Mia's careful handwriting. She wrote, "David knows we've been watching him. Jake wants to run tonight, but I think it's too late. If something happens to us, I hope someone finds this and understands what we were trying to do. The other children deserve justice too." Caleb had been unusually quiet during the FBI briefing, absorbing information about the investigation with the serious attention he brought to everything involving Mia and Jake. But now, he spoke up with a question that surprised the adults. "Agent Valdez, have you found Jake's final message yet?" The FBI agent looked confused. "What final message?" "In my dreams, Jake and Mia keep pointing to something in the tree. something they really want us to find. I think Jake carved a message somewhere that we haven't discovered yet. Eli had been wondering about Caleb's recurring dreams, trying to balance scientific skepticism with respect for his son's intuitive connection to the case. The dreams had been remarkably consistent, Mia and Jake pointing toward something in the upper branches of the oak tree, both children showing urgency about whatever they wanted found. "It's worth checking," Agent Valdez said diplomatically. "Child victims sometimes leave final messages in places where they feel safe. If Jake thought he was going to die, he might have carved something in the tree itself." That afternoon, with FBI crime scene technicians and tree climbing specialists, they conducted the most thorough examination yet of the oak tree that supported the treehouse. The search focused on the upper branches that would have been accessible to a 10-year-old boy, but might have been missed during previous investigations. 40 feet above the ground, in a fork between two major branches that was invisible from below, they found Jake's last message. Carved into the bark with what must have been desperate urgency were the words, "Bodies under Big Rock by Creek," followed by an arrow pointing northwest, and the date 7/12/94. The message had been carved on the same day that Mia had written her final diary entry, July 12, 1994, the day they disappeared. Jake had somehow managed to climb high enough in the tree to leave a message that wouldn't be discovered accidentally, a message that provided specific directions to burial sites that Mia's map had only indicated generally. He knew they were going to be killed, Caleb said softly, watching the FBI technicians photograph and document Jake's carving. He climbed up there to leave directions so their bodies would be found someday. Following Jake's directions, investigators discovered 2 additional burial sites near the creek that ran through the Patterson property. The sites contained the remains of 4 more children, victims whose disappearances had never been connected to the Hendricks family because they had been fostered through different agencies in neighboring counties. The discovery brought the total number of confirmed victims to 8 children, murdered over a 6-year period, making the case one of the most prolific serial killing investigations in the state's history. But more importantly, it validated Mia and Jake's desperate final efforts to ensure that justice would eventually be served, even if they couldn't live to see it. As preparations began for the climactic phase of the investigation, the coordinated arrests of network participants across multiple states, Eli found himself thinking about the courage required for 2 children to face certain death while still trying to protect others. Mia and Jake had known their lives were in danger, but they had spent their final day documenting evidence and leaving messages rather than simply trying to escape. They were heroes, he told Caleb that evening, as they sat in their own living room, watching news coverage of the investigation that had grown from their simple treehouse project. 12 and 10 years old, and they showed more courage than most adults could manage. The next morning would bring the coordinated arrests that had been planned for weeks, culminating an investigation that had started with a 25-cent estate sale purchase and had become a federal case involving multiple states and dozens of suspects. But for Eli and Caleb, the most important victory had already been achieved. Mia and Jake's voices had finally been heard, and their deaths would finally have the meaning they had died trying to create. The treehouse stood empty in the November cold, but it no longer felt haunted by tragedy. Instead, it felt sanctified by the courage of 2 children who had refused to let evil triumph, even when triumph cost them everything they had to give. Their evidence had survived, their message had been received, and their sacrifice would save other children from the fate they couldn't escape. The arrests began at dawn on November 15th. Exactly 4 months after Eli and Caleb had first climbed into the treehouse and discovered Mia's diary. FBI agents and local law enforcement officers executed simultaneous warrants across 6 states, targeting the network of adoption agencies, social workers, foster parents, and buyers who had participated in what prosecutors were calling the largest child trafficking operation in regional history. Eli and Caleb watched the coordinated operation unfold from Agent Valdez's command post in the Pine Valley Community Center, surrounded by monitors showing live feeds from arrest sites and radio communications from teams across multiple jurisdictions. The evidence that Mia had carefully documented 30 years earlier was finally being used to bring justice to the people who had destroyed so many young lives. David Hendricks is in custody, came the first report from the team at his construction office. No resistance. He was waiting for us with a lawyer and a prepared statement. More reports followed throughout the morning. Corrupt social workers arrested at their offices, adoption agency administrators taken into custody at their homes, and buyers confronted with evidence of their participation in illegal adoptions. Most went quietly, their shock at being discovered after decades of operating with impunity evident in their stunned compliance with arrest procedures. But not all of the arrests proceeded smoothly. Margaret Sutton, the adoption agency director who had been the primary liaison between buyers and the trafficking network, barricaded herself in her office building with what appeared to be the physical files documenting 30 years of illegal adoptions. The standoff lasted 3 hours before she finally surrendered, but not before attempting to destroy evidence that would have been crucial to identifying additional victims. The police evidence box that emerged from Margaret Sutton's office contained the official documentation that validated everything Mia had suspected and documented. Bank records showing payments to foster families for children who were never officially adopted. Correspondence with buyers discussing the ages, appearances, and backgrounds of available children. Medical records indicating that some children had been drugged during transport to make them more compliant. Most significantly, the box contained a ledger that recorded not just the children who had been sold, but also the children who had been murdered when sales couldn't be arranged or when they became too dangerous to the operation. Tommy, Lisa, Mia, and Jake were listed alongside 4 other children, their names entered with cold bureaucratic precision next to notations like disposal necessary and elimination completed. 8 children confirmed murdered, Agent Valdez announced to the command post team. 14 children sold through illegal adoptions, most of them now adults who can be located and offered support services. Total estimated revenue from the operation, $2.4 million over 15 years. The human cost couldn't be quantified in financial terms, but the scope of the operation was staggering. Mia's documentation had exposed a criminal enterprise that had operated across state lines for more than a decade, destroying families and traumatizing children for the simple purpose of generating profit for adults who viewed vulnerable kids as inventory to be managed and sold. As the day progressed and suspects were processed through the legal system, Eli found himself thinking about the children who hadn't survived to see justice served. Tommy and Lisa Brennan, who had been murdered at ages 9 and 11 for the crime of trying to stay together. Mia and Jake Foster, who had died trying to expose the truth about what had happened to the children who came before them, but he also thought about the children who had survived, the 14 individuals who had been sold through the network and were now adults living their own lives, many of them unaware that their adoptions had been illegal. The FBI was in the process of contacting them to offer counseling services and help them understand their true histories. But the initial contacts had revealed that many of them had grown up in loving families who had genuinely believed they were participating in legitimate adoptions. "It's complicated," Agent Valdez explained when Eli asked about the survivors. "Some of the buyers were genuinely loving families who wanted children and believed they were helping kids who needed homes. Others were people who specifically wanted children with no legal protections or official oversight. Sorting out which is going to take months of investigation." The most emotional moment of the day came when Agent Valdez received a call from FBI agents in Denver who had located Maria Santos, formerly Maria Foster, Mia and Jake's aunt, who had been trying to find her sister's children for 30 years. She had been told by the foster care system that the children couldn't be located and had spent decades wondering what had happened to them. "She wants to come to Pine Valley," Agent Valdez told Eli and Caleb. "She wants to see where Mia and Jake lived and died, and she wants to thank the people who finally gave them justice." That evening, as the news coverage shifted from the arrests to the broader implications of the case, Eli and Caleb returned to the treehouse for what they both understood would be their final visit as investigators. The structure had been released by the FBI crime scene teams, but it would always be more than just a building to them. It was the place where they had discovered that grief could be transformed into purpose, and that sometimes the most important victories come from helping others rather than healing yourself. The evidence box that had been recovered from Margaret Sutton's office sat in the FBI command post, containing the official records that validated everything Mia and Jake had died trying to prove. Their sacrifice had finally achieved its intended purpose, but the cost had been almost more than Eli could bear to contemplate. "They were just children," Caleb said as they stood in the treehouse, surrounded by the physical reminders of Mia and Jake's courage. "They shouldn't have had to die to save other kids." "No, they shouldn't have," Eli agreed. "But they chose to fight even when they knew they couldn't win. That's what heroes do. They choose to do the right thing even when it costs them everything." Maria Santos arrived in Pine Valley 3 days after the arrests, a small woman in her 60s with the same dark eyes that had looked out from Mia and Jake's photograph. She carried with her a manila envelope containing 30 years of correspondence with social workers, private investigators, and anyone else who might have been able to help her find her sister's children. The papers documented a relentless search that had never given up hope, even when every official channel had insisted the children could not be located. Eli and Caleb met her at the Pine Valley Cemetery, where temporary markers indicated the burial sites for the 8 children whose remains had been recovered from the woods surrounding the treehouse. The official headstones were still being prepared, but Maria had brought flowers for Mia and Jake, white roses that she placed carefully on the disturbed earth where their bodies now rested in peace. "I always knew they were dead," she said quietly, kneeling beside the graves. "Mia would never have stopped looking for me if she was alive. But I kept searching because I needed to know what happened to them. I needed to know they weren't forgotten." Meeting between Maria and the people who had finally solved her niece and nephew's murder was emotional in ways that Eli hadn't anticipated. This woman had spent 3 decades grieving children she had been prevented from protecting, carrying guilt and helplessness that mirrored his own feelings about Sarah's death and Caleb's struggles with loss. "Tell me about finding them," Maria asked as they walked toward the treehouse. "Tell me about Mia's diary and how you knew to keep looking." Caleb took the lead in explaining their discovery, describing the progression from simple restoration project to criminal investigation with the kind of detailed precision that reminded Eli of Mia's own systematic approach to documentation. As his son spoke, Eli realized how much the investigation had changed the boy, not just healing his grief, but giving him confidence and purpose that went far beyond what any therapy session could have accomplished. "Mia was brave," Caleb concluded. "She knew she was going to die, but she made sure someone would eventually find the evidence to catch the people who killed her." Maria listened to the story with tears streaming down her face, but when Caleb finished, she was smiling through her grief. "That sounds exactly like Mia. Even as a little girl, she was the one who took care of everyone else. When her mother, my sister, was sick, Mia was the one who made sure Jake ate and got to school and had clean clothes. She was 12 going on 40. They spent the afternoon in the treehouse, with Maria examining every artifact that Mia and Jake had left behind. She touched the carved heart on the floor, ran her fingers over Jake's broken compass, and read. Selected passages from the diary that had documented her niece's final weeks. Most importantly, she listened to Caleb describe his dreams about Mia and Jake, nodding with the recognition of someone who understood that some connections transcend ordinary explanation. She's been trying to reach someone for 30 years. Maria said finally, I think she knew you would understand what needed to be done. The police evidence box that had been recovered during the arrests was officially returned to the victims' families during a ceremony at the community center that evening. FBI Director Patricia Valdez presented Maria Santos with the original documents that had been compiled by her niece, evidence that had ultimately brought down the criminal network and provided closure for 8 families who had never known what happened to their children. Mia Foster's investigation was more thorough than many police cases I've supervised, Agent Valdez said during the ceremony. Her documentation was systematic, her evidence was carefully preserved, and her courage in gathering information under dangerous circumstances saved the lives of children who might otherwise have been killed. She was 12 years old, and she accomplished what seasoned investigators struggle to achieve. The ceremony was attended by representatives from all 8 families whose children had been murdered by the trafficking network, as well as several of the adult survivors who had been sold through illegal adoptions. The gathering was both a memorial service for the children who had died and a celebration of justice finally achieved after 3 decades of waiting. But the most meaningful moment came when Maria Santos asked to speak privately with Eli and Caleb. After the official ceremony ended, she led them back to the treehouse one final time, carrying something she had brought from Denver but hadn't yet shared. This belonged to Mia, she said, pulling a small wooden jewelry box from her purse. My sister gave it to her for her 10th birthday, just before she died. When the children were taken into foster care, they weren't allowed to bring many personal possessions, but somehow Mia managed to keep this. Inside the jewelry box was a silver locket containing a photograph of Mia and Jake with their mother, taken before illness and tragedy had destroyed their family. There was also a folded piece of paper, a letter that Mia had written to her aunt years before her death, a letter that had never been mailed because the foster care system had no record of Maria's address. Aunt Maria, Caleb read from the letter, I hope you are still looking for us, because Jake and I are still hoping you will find us. We try to be good kids, but sometimes it's hard when we don't have a real home. I take care of Jake like Mom told me to, and he takes care of me too. If something happens to us, please know that we never stopped missing you, and we never stopped believing you would try to find us. Love, Mia. The letter had been written 2 years before Mia's death, but it demonstrated the hope and faith that had sustained her through multiple foster placements and ultimately given her the strength to document the crimes that had cost her life. Even in her darkest moments, she had believed that someone who loved her was still searching. I want you to have this, Maria said, pressing the jewelry box into Caleb's hands. Mia would want it to go to someone who understood what she was trying to accomplish. As they stood together in the treehouse where Mia had conducted her investigation and documented the evidence that had finally brought her justice, Eli realized that their involvement in the case was coming to an end. The arrests had been made, the evidence had been processed, and the survivors had been contacted. The criminal network that had operated for 15 years had been dismantled, and the families of the victims finally had answers to questions that had tormented them for decades. But more importantly, Eli and Caleb had found their own healing through helping others find theirs. The process of solving Mia and Jake's murder had given them a way to work through their own grief while creating something meaningful from their loss. They had honored Sarah's memory by protecting other children, and they had found their way back to each other by working together on something that mattered more than their individual pain. The treehouse would be preserved as a memorial to the children who had died there, but it would also serve as a reminder that courage and determination can triumph over evil, even when the victory comes too late to save the heroes who made it possible. Mia and Jake's sacrifice had finally achieved its intended purpose, and their story would inspire others to keep fighting for justice even when the odds seemed impossible to overcome. 6 months later, Eli and Caleb returned to the treehouse on a warm spring morning that painted the mountain valley in shades of green that Sarah would have loved. The memorial plaque had been installed at the base of the great oak tree, a simple bronze marker that read, "In memory of Mia and Jake, forever safe in this tree," along with the names of the 6 other children whose courage had helped expose the trafficking network that had destroyed so many young lives. The treehouse itself had been carefully restored using traditional carpentry methods that honored the craftsmanship of its original builder. The county had purchased the Patterson property to preserve it as a memorial park, but they had also designated it as a therapeutic retreat for children in the foster care system, a place where kids who had experienced trauma could find the kind of refuge that Mia and Jake had created for themselves. Caleb was different now, not just older, but more confident in ways that went beyond his 10 years. The investigation had given him a sense of purpose that had carried over into other areas of his life. He had joined the school baseball team, made friends with classmates who shared his interest in mystery novels and detective stories, and developed the kind of easy social connections that had worried Mrs. Henderson just a year earlier. More importantly, he no longer carried the weight of unprocessed grief that had made him seem older than his years. Sarah's death was still a loss that shaped his life, but it was no longer the defining tragedy that prevented him from engaging with the world around him. He talked about his mother with warmth and affection rather than the careful neutrality that had characterized his earlier attempts to protect himself from pain. "Dad, look what I found!" Caleb called from the sleeping loft, where he was helping organize supplies for the first group of foster children who would be using the retreat. "Next month. There's another message carved up here, but it's new." Eli climbed the rope ladder to examine Caleb's discovery. Carved into a beam that wouldn't have been visible during their earlier investigations were fresh letters spelling out, "Thank you for finding us, M and J," in a style that perfectly matched the other carvings Mia and Jake had left in the treehouse. The carving shouldn't have existed. The treehouse had been sealed as a crime scene for months, then carefully restored by professional contractors who would have noticed any existing markings. No one had been in the structure unsupervised since. The memorial work had been completed, but the message was undeniably there, carved with the same amateur technique, but fresh precision that suggested it had been created recently. "When do you think it appeared?" Eli asked, running his fingers over the letters. "I don't know," Caleb admitted, "but I think Mia wanted us to know that she and Jake are okay now. They got the justice they died trying to achieve, and they can finally rest." Eli found himself believing his son's interpretation, despite his natural skepticism about supernatural explanations. The investigation had involved too many coincidences and intuitive leaps to dismiss the possibility that something beyond normal understanding had guided their discoveries. Caleb's dreams, the preserved evidence, even their decision to attend the estate sale where they found the treehouse, all of it felt like pieces of a plan that had been set in motion 30 years earlier. The memorial plaque ceremony had drawn hundreds of people from across the region, including law enforcement officers, social workers, and families who had been affected by the trafficking network. But it had also attracted foster children from multiple states, kids who understood instinctively what Mia and Jake had experienced, and who needed to see that someone cared enough to remember children who had been forgotten by the systems that were supposed to protect them. Margaret Chen, the librarian who had helped with their research, had established a scholarship fund for foster children pursuing education beyond high school. Robert Martinez had returned to active duty as a volunteer consultant, helping law enforcement agencies investigate cold cases involving missing children. Detective Sarah Chen had been promoted to head a new task force focusing specifically on crimes against foster children. The network's conviction had resulted in prison sentences ranging from 15 years to life without parole for the main participants. David Hendricks had received the longest sentence after prosecutors proved his direct involvement in 8 murders and 14 illegal adoptions. The corrupt social workers and adoption agency administrators received shorter sentences in exchange for their cooperation in identifying additional victims and survivors. Most importantly, the 14 adults who had been sold through the network as children were receiving counseling and legal support to help them understand their histories and reconnect with biological families when possible. 3 of them had been successfully reunited with relatives who had been searching for them for decades, creating the kind of healing that made all the pain and investigation worthwhile. The Treehouse retreat program had become a model for other states considering similar approaches to helping traumatized foster children. The idea of using nature-based therapy in combination with traditional counseling had proven remarkably effective, particularly for children who had difficulty trusting adult authority figures. The treehouse itself served as both a safe space and a symbol of survival, proof that children could overcome even the most terrible circumstances. Eli's own life had settled into patterns that felt sustainable in ways he hadn't experienced since Sarah's death. His work as a park ranger had expanded to include consultation on the retreat program, combining his love of the outdoors with his newfound understanding of childhood trauma. The investigation had given him skills and knowledge that made him valuable in helping other families navigate crises, and he had discovered that helping others heal was one of the most effective ways to continue his own healing process. Most significantly, he had moved Sarah's wedding ring from his nightstand drawer to a jewelry box in the living room, where it served as a memorial rather than a daily reminder of loss. The transition had been gradual and natural, occurring as his understanding of grief had evolved from something to be endured to something that could be transformed into compassion for others experiencing similar losses. "I think Mom would be proud of what we accomplished," Caleb said as they prepared to leave the treehouse after their morning visit. "She always said the most important thing was helping people who needed help." "I think she would be proud," Eli agreed. "And I think Mia and Jake would be proud too. Their deaths finally meant something more than just tragedy." As they walked back toward their truck, Eli found himself thinking about the nature of healing and the unpredictable ways that purpose could emerge from pain. A year earlier, he and Caleb had been isolated by grief, unable to connect with each other or engage meaningfully with the world around them. The treehouse had given them a project that turned their individual sorrows into shared mission, transforming them from victims of circumstance into advocates for justice. The memorial plaque caught the morning sunlight as they drove away, its bronze letters promising that Mia, Jake, and the other murdered children would never again be forgotten. But more than that, it represented the victory that Mia had died trying to achieve, proof that courage and determination could ultimately triumph over evil, even when the victory came too late to save the heroes who had made it possible. The treehouse stood empty in the spring sunshine, waiting for the next group of children who would need its refuge and healing. It no longer felt haunted by tragedy, but blessed by the sacrifice of 2 children who had refused to let their deaths be meaningless. Their legacy would live on in every child who found safety in the treehouse, every family that was reunited. Through improved investigation techniques and every person who chose to fight for justice, even when the odds seemed impossible to overcome. Mia and Jake were finally truly safe in their tree, and their story would continue to inspire others to believe that even the smallest actions could change the world for someone who desperately needed that change.